Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Gaming Mind, a new psychology of video games and the power of play, by Alexander Kriss, Ph.D. Narrated by Matthew Josdal. It is play that is the universal and that belongs to health. Playing facilitates growth and therefore health. Playing leads into group relationships. Playing can be a form of communication in psychotherapy. The natural thing is playing. D.W. Winnicott, Playing and Reality. Author's Note: This book centers on two things that are hard to talk about, that we often feel we're not supposed to talk about: video games and psychotherapy. In the interest of defanging these topics, I want to make clear from the start some of my choices, specifically the use of certain terms and my stance on confidentiality. Unless otherwise noted, game should be regarded as synonymous with video game, itself an anachronistic term that has never been properly revised. In discussing individuals, the term gamer is used only in particular circumstances, as it carries an emotional and political charge, levied in some circles as a derogation and in others as a proud self-designation. I prefer the term player to more broadly and accurately describe a person interacting with a game. This book includes several descriptions of psychotherapy. One broad reason for doing so, in my view, is to demystify the process and demonstrate how treatment can serve as a safe, supportive environment to help people work through various issues. At the same time, it is important that educating the listener does not come at the expense of confidentiality, for the sake of the individuals described, as well as anyone who might be considering treatment, but has concerns about trusting a professional to treat their innermost thoughts and feelings with care and respect. I have attempted to responsibly walk the line between representing psychotherapy authentically while protecting the identities of those discussed. The cases herein are all based on real people with whom I have worked, but their names and other biographical details have been altered significantly, and in some instances, the themes from two or more treatments were combined into a composite case. In my private practice, I always obtain written consent from patients to include aspects of their treatment in my writing, on the condition that confidentiality is not breached. I take few things more seriously than the privacy of psychotherapy, and want any listener of this book to be assured that my intention is to illuminate and never to exploit. Chapter 1. Me, You, and Silent Hill 2. What do the games we play, and how we play them, say about who we are? What an abyss of uncertainty whenever the mind feels overtaken by itself, when it, the seeker, is at the same time the dark region through which it must go seeking, and where all its equipment will avail it nothing. Marcel Proust, Swan's Way. Basically, she said, he's a gamer kid, you know. Everyone nodded. They knew. I sat in a weekly staff meeting at the outpatient clinic where I worked as a graduate student in clinical psychology. The chief purpose of the meeting was to present the team with new cases coming into the clinic so we could decide what treatment, and potentially which therapist, would be most appropriate to meet their needs. A few moments earlier, a colleague across from me had begun to discuss a young man she'd recently interviewed for the first time. He was 21 years old, living at home with his parents and siblings, enrolled in college but struggling. Then, while describing the specific circumstances of this man's life, she paused, then winced, like there was an idea in her mind that she couldn't quite put into words. Gamer kid. It was the way she said it, not with malice or contempt, but indifference. She and I worked together in the field of understanding, yet she presented gamer kid as a concept that merited no scrutiny. She was saving us valuable time. We all knew what she meant. Let's just move on already. As though this phrase, or any phrase, could sum up an individual's character. I felt unsettled, particularly because this was not how I expected my colleague to behave. If an insensitive clinician speaks insensitively, it would be upsetting, yet easy to quantify. But I'd known this woman for many months, and had come to admire her natural compassion and curiosity, which to my mind represented the ideal characteristics of a psychotherapist. How could she speak of this young man so dismissively? "Sorry," I interjected, unsure if I wanted to convey offense or remorse. "I don't think I know what you mean." She must have detected my prickliness as she dropped the colloquialism and dived into professional jargon, also unusual for her. I mean that he lacks the basic interpersonal skills that would be developmentally appropriate for his age. He doesn't have relationships or hobbies to speak of, and he's barely getting by in school. All he really does is play video games. But what does he play? Everyone around the table, an impressive collection of psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, and trainees, looked at me blankly. They knew me as someone unlikely to eat up time in meetings with inane questions, yet no one could see what I was driving at. What difference did it make what he plays? Even I didn't know exactly what my point was, or what it was that I was trying to make the others understand. But something was unraveling inside me, a knot of emotion, a part of myself far removed from my identity as a grown-up professional. Images flashed before my eyes. Old feelings rose up, familiar and alien, all at once. I felt on the verge of crying out. Proust once wrote of a tea-soaked Madeleine that, upon touching his tongue, transported him instantly to a childhood long obscured by the haze of the past. Gamer kid, that callous phrase, was my Madeleine, the unexpected trigger rocketing me back in time to dormant memories turned newly vivid. When I was 5 years old, I had a pig called Hen Wen. She was an unusual pet, to be sure. Though small, measuring no more than a few pink pixels in length, Hen Wen possessed clairvoyant abilities sought by the diabolical Horned King, and as her caregiver, it was my responsibility to keep her safe. My father shared the burden with me to some extent, as the two of us played Sierra Online's 1986 game, The Black Cauldron, together on the IBM AT he kept in his basement home office. My access to this virtual world was an unusual privilege I didn't yet appreciate. My father's employer had furnished the powerful computer we used at a time when most families, if they owned a home computer at all, were forced to settle for the cheaper but vastly inferior Apple IIe. Babbage's, one of the first retail outlets to sell video games to consumers in the U.S., happened to have opened one of its first locations a few streets from my father's office in downtown Boston, Massachusetts, and my father happened to be friends with the owner. When he asked his friend to recommend something fun he might do with his son on the computer, the son who had shown markedly less interest in organized physical activity than his older brother, the friend suggested we give The Black Cauldron a try. Fun would be a gross understatement. The game mesmerized me. The visuals were sophisticated for the time, though the graphics were blocky and the color palette limited. But the chief appeal was the suggestion that my decisions had a meaningful impact on the world. The player, inhabiting the role of a humble farmhand called Terran, had to lead Hen Wen to safe haven. In the book or film version, both of which predated the game, though I had heard of neither, Hen Wen's capture by the Horned King's minions represented the dramatic incident that catalyzed the rest of the story. But in the game, This trajectory was not wholly determined by author or director. Instead, branching possibilities were designed to accommodate the actions of the player. If my father and I raced fast enough from the starting screen of Terran's farm to the well-hidden refuge of the fair folk several screens away, Hen Wen could be safe for the rest of the game. If not, we would endeavor to rescue her and risk the possibility of her death in the process. For a young child, the idea that actions have consequences is developmentally novel, filled with excitement and anxiety. My father, whose superior dexterity at the keyboard demanded that he take control of Terran while I barked instructions from his lap, must have been maddened to tears when I asked him to play and replay the opening sequence. Sometimes we skirted disaster and delivered Hen Wen to safety. Other times we were too slow, or forgot the way, or Terran snagged unfairly on a pixelated bush, and a winged beast appeared on the screen along with a box of text. "Oh no, it's one of the Horned King's evil Gwithaints," to carry Hen Wen off in its clutches. Those afternoons on my father's lap represent my earliest memories of feeling as if my choices mattered, and provided my first glimpse of the complex emotional landscape that defines human psychology. The risk of losing Hen Wen was both terrifying and thrilling. Her capture filled me with worry for her safety, as well as guilt over that preceding thrill, and anger at my father's maladroitness on the keyboard. Likewise, a successful rescue involved not only relief and pride, but also a dim awareness that it was really my father, not I, who deserved the credit. I was 7 years old when I nearly had a panic attack while playing The Legend of Kyrandia. The game, a natural descendant of titles like The Black Cauldron, was a story-based adventure in which the player had to solve puzzles and interact with other characters in order to advance the plot. My father still sat beside me, though I took control of the mouse and keyboard a little more often by this point, and I continued to delight in testing out the consequences of my in-game actions. Kyrandia seemed to share my glee in subjecting the player's character, Brandon, to a trial-and-error approach, as doing so often resulted in his outlandishly graphic demise. As my father and I neared the end of the game, I'd already led Brandon to plummet off a bridge, succumb to snake venom, be devoured by red-eyed creatures in a pitch-black cavern, burn alive, be devoured by a giant frog, and burn alive again. We were now in the castle held by the game's villain, the demented court jester Malcolm, when Brandon encountered a friend, Herman, possessed by Malcolm's dark magic. The possession was made clear by Herman's sickly green pallor, and he loomed menacingly with a hacksaw in hand, one that Brandon had lent him earlier in the game. "Brandon," Herman cried, "I have your saw." Later versions of the game would feature actors performing the voices, but our copy only displayed the dialogue as text, which my father read aloud in a gravelly voice to indicate Herman's altered state. "That's okay, Herman," Brandon replied. "You can keep it. But I sharpened it just for you." An electric current shot through my body. Something about this tableau, a gentle soul twisted by madness, turned against me, unsettled me in a way that depictions of poison or immolation had not. Depending on the player's action, Brandon could restore his friend to a lucid state. But not knowing what to do, I charged forward, which prompted Herman to saw Brandon in half and bring up the familiar "Game Over" screen. It read simply, "Rest in peace, Brandon." The consequence of this choice felt too great. There were machinations at work within me that I did not fully understand, but it was clear that I'd struck upon a scenario too volatile to be safely contained within the unreality of the game. My father reflexively reloaded our last saved state, returning us to shortly before the dreaded encounter with Herman. I grew anxious and fretful, squirming in my chair and averting my eyes from the screen. I moaned slightly, out of a developing sense of nausea. My father looked down, saw my distress, and promptly turned off the computer monitor. A year later, when I was 8, my father and I poured hours upon hours into Myst, a game about exploring abandoned islands strewn with esoteric puzzles. Through a first-person perspective, the player began on a dock with no instruction, and found that by clicking on the screen, he could move through the vividly realized world and interact with objects within it. As secrets were discovered and puzzles solved, passageways to new island worlds opened. Myst was an apex of bonding for my father and me. The game's slow pace and minimal guidance meant we would spend nearly as much time discussing possible solutions as actually sitting in front of the computer. "Have we tried counting all the switch boxes on the island?" my father might ask me across the breakfast table. My mother would eye us like we were speaking in a foreign language. "Maybe that's the number we're supposed to put in the stairway panel," I'd reply. Then we would race to the basement to put our theory to the test. Cheating in the pre-internet age was expensive, requiring either the purchase of hint books or the use of telephone tip lines that charged 95 cents per minute. As a result, progressing through Myst demanded slow, collaborative experimentation, my father and I drawing on our years of puzzle-based game experience in order to unlock the mysteries of this most enigmatic title. My excitement was magnified by the fact that Myst was a runaway hit. From its release, it would hold the title of best-selling PC game in history for the next 9 years, which meant that several of my classmates were also playing it. Up to this point, I'd rarely had the opportunity to share my passion with friends. I might have occasionally gone to my friend Izzy's house to watch him play Doom, a pioneering first-person shooter about a demon-battling space marine that required too much hand-eye coordination for me to even make it through the first level. Or my pal Greg and I would team up for an hour or so in the 2-player mode of Sonic the Hedgehog 2 on his Sega Genesis. But few of my friends were as devoted to playing and discussing games as I was, and none had gravitated toward the long-form, story-based titles that so enthralled me. Games had largely remained an activity between father and son for me until now. Myst promised to shatter this barrier between my home and the outside world. As one of the first games to take advantage of CD-ROM technology, and promising previously unimagined audio-visual wonder, it seemed that everyone I knew was clamoring for a copy. I couldn't wait to talk to them about it. My enthusiasm proved short-lived. The first friend I approached was a girl called Jamie, who also played Myst on a nightly basis with her father. But when I asked her which island she was currently working through, she replied, "There's only one." "No," I corrected. "Once you solve puzzles in the first location, you can go to new ones." "I'm in the one that's full of tree houses. It's cool." "Puzzles? What do you mean?" "You know, all the stuff you do in the game, like the room with the boiler, the room with all the stars. Haven't you started adding pages to the books in the library?" "Look," she said, incredulous. "I don't know what you're talking about. There are no puzzles." Then, with disdain, "Myst is not a video game." Many people, I would learn years later, shared Jamie's relationship with Myst, seeing it as a digital Zen garden to be wandered through without specific purpose or intention. Like Jamie, some didn't even realize there was anything to do. They were not versed in the language of games in the way my father and I were, and Myst presented its goals in an unusually opaque manner. These ungame-like qualities no doubt helped make Myst the unlikely blockbuster it became. But my exchange with Jamie also taught me that interest in a video game carried unforeseen implications. This passion of mine was apparently viewed by others as radioactive, and my proximity to it therefore put me at risk of being seen as a mutant. As I grew older, games became an increasingly private interest. Tomb Raider, released in 1996, marked the watershed moment when I began to play alone. I was at the onset of puberty and had the nagging sense that I didn't want to hang out with the game's bosomy protagonist, Lara Croft, with my father sitting beside me. Looking back, I can scarcely believe my gall in asking him to pay for a box emblazoned with the image of Croft in a tight shirt and cut-off shorts, staring out at her intended young, male, heterosexual audience. I hold no less wonder that he agreed to it without remark. The whole procedure carried an unspoken, illicit aura. If shy of criminal, it felt as though I must at least be doing something shameful. Once out of the box, my relationship with Tomb Raider continued to walk a line between excitement and discomfort. Croft was not the first female protagonist I'd steered through a game world. That distinction went to Xanthia, from the second installment of the Kyrandia series. But she was the most confusing, or perhaps I was just at a point in my life when I felt the most confused. Croft was both hyper-competent heroine and unabashed sexual object, tough warrior and the player's puppet on a string. The game reveled in these juxtapositions, encouraging the veneration and destruction of Croft's body in equal measure. The player directed her from behind, admiring her figure while also unavoidably leading her to mortal doom, with a regularity that suited the game's ancient trap-ridden locales. At the player's direction, Croft could be subjected to all manner of ends, from falling into a pit of spikes to drowning in a subterranean pool, and her deaths were intimate in their specificity, graphic, often slow, occasionally humiliating, and the camera always lingered just a half-second longer than necessary before the game reloaded. Unlike my experience of death in The Legend of Kyrandia, which ranged from comic delight to overwhelming horror, violence in Tomb Raider was inextricably tied to its omnipresent sexuality. There was a perverse thrill in watching Lara die. I wasn't the only person who connected with the game as a simulator for sexually charged aggression. Tomb Raider's creator, Toby Gard, acknowledged this phenomenon years later in an interview, when he stated plainly in a bewildered tone, "People just loved killing her." At the time, I was unaware that my muddled teenage instincts might be considered normal in some circles. It seemed clear to me that my relationship with Tomb Raider was taboo and needed to be sequestered from the prying eyes of classmates who jumped at the opportunity to ostracize one of their number. The specter of judgment from the Jamies of the world loomed larger than any actual dressing down I endured. I'd gleaned just enough of what it might be like to bear the scarlet mark of a gamer from overheard conversations at school, offhand remarks by my older brother, insults hurled at game-loving nerds on popular TV shows. And so, in my mind, I endeavored to keep a public foot in the normal social world, and a surreptitious one in the virtual spaces that I loved, but assumed most others would not understand. My father had certainly stopped understanding them. I didn't play games in his home office anymore. I'd graduated, or perhaps been demoted, to my own spot on the other side of the basement, dimly lit, with my computer and a tangle of consoles and controllers. Sometimes he'd walk past on his way up or down the stairs. "What's this one?" he would ask. "It's called Ape Escape," I'd reply, voice cracking. "Uh-huh. And what's the point?" "I mean, I'm this kid, and there are these apes, and they, escaped." He would chuckle, say, "Boy, oh boy," and then continue up or down. I had lost the ability to communicate my fascination to him. Maybe I'd never had it, or maybe I was failing to notice that his question, "What's the point?" had grown ever more existential with each passing year. He didn't just want to know what the goal of the game was, but, "What is the point, child? For God's sake, who cared if the apes escaped or not?" My best friend from the age of 12 was Bjorn, and he was highly dismissive of video games. An affable kid with icy blue eyes and an intrepid spirit benefiting his Nordic heritage, Bjorn classified games as impediments to more worthwhile adolescent pursuits, particularly the goal to end all goals, which was, of course, intimate contact with girls. When hanging out at his house, which I did at least a few afternoons per week, Bjorn and I made a habit of chiding his younger brother over his obsession with Pokemon Snap, a tranquil Nintendo 64 game about traversing colorful ecosystems while trying to capture the clearest photographs of the elusive, fantastical creatures that hid within them. "Why would you want to take pictures of fake monsters?" Bjorn posed, inviting me to join in, "when you could have sex with a real girl." We were, in fact, both quite far from the prospects of sex, though by the start of high school Bjorn had dated multiple girls in our class, while my longest relationship to speak of was a fraught one with Lara Croft. From my point of view, then, Bjorn was the undisputed expert. If he said video games were anathema to the fairer sex, he must know what he's talking about. My parents didn't make themselves particularly available to talk about these issues. After all, they let Tomb Raider into the house without the barest discussion. Sex was a blind spot for them, and so I felt entirely dependent on my hormonal friend to lead the way through the morass, even as I often felt frightened and unready to explore sexuality in my life outside of games. I showed Tomb Raider to Bjorn and its mélange of ways to control and abuse Croft, which he found amusing but inconsequential. The appeal of spending time with this virtual character in her virtual world was lost on him. The real world held much greater interest. Bjorn preferred to look up pictures of supermodels on the internet with me, or talk about his latest make-out session with the girl he was seeing. If an experience wasn't grounded in reality, it struck him as tedious. But for me, these topics and images could feel overwhelming without the buffer of unreality, the contained fantasy I'd grown so comfortable with in games. The truth was, our afternoons spent needling Bjorn's brother typically occurred at my urging. Bjorn was always up for this pastime, a way to vent some teenage angst on a smaller, helpless target, and I probably derived some similar gratification. But secretly I liked to do this, because while we teased, I could watch his brother search for Pokémon in the brush, which I found soothing to the same degree I found talking about sex anxiety-provoking. My friendship with Bjorn did not solely orbit around pubescent impulses, but there was a theme of him pushing me, in a genuine, loving way, to be normal. He tried to pique my interest in sports and exercise, and liked to compose daydreams of what exotic lands we might travel to as adults, what adventures we might go on, who we might meet, all in the real world. His vision of a vibrant social existence intoxicated me, and my parents encouraged Bjorn's confident, extroverted influence on the boy they saw as their bright but awkward younger child. Less than a month after my 14th birthday, Bjorn committed suicide. A rumor would soon spread that he'd been diagnosed with and treated for bipolar disorder for years. A gentle soul twisted by madness. I'd never heard anything about mental illness from either him or his parents, and I had no idea if it was true. Cold comfort regardless. If it were so obvious, shouldn't I have...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?